We are really honored to be here in the library doing these tea talks. I can't believe we're halfway there. This is number 3. Today's program actually is the key that really the whole idea for this series came about. And it's from incidents that happened last year around Charlottesville and in New Orleans, in the removal of some Confederate monuments and that whole dialogue the country had. So today we're going to be looking at how we remember, what are places and sources of memory. And one of the things that we had a little hard time with is when we used the image that we have, when we repeated that mythology about the Confederate memorial in York, Maine. So I have to make sure that I correct that statement. There was an article, when I did my research, I didn't see the article from Deb McDermott talking about the monument, and I do have a copy of the article, and we sent it out. So I'm going to leave the other experts on our panel to talk a little bit more of that. And so with us today we have Senator David Waters. His bio is in the book. Joel Christine Gill. And Eric Aldridge, who will all be talking about different sites of cultural memory, and I'll just pass it right on over to them to start the program.
Well, thank you, Jerry Ann, and good to see everybody. And I guess each of us have about 10 or 15 minutes to lay some things out, and then it's like we light the fuse, and then we step back, and you're going to say whatever you want to say anyways, despite what we said, or maybe what we should have said. So I did want to start with the Civil War and its commemoration, and what I would call a kind of problem of Civil War monuments. It's become quite direct to us with the removal of Confederate monuments, but I want to talk about the larger issue of why the memorialization of the Civil War had the effect of erasing black history from that struggle. Some of you may have seen Coates's new book, We Were 8 Years in Power, and in this book he has an interesting meditation on his sense of disaffection from the Civil War narrative. And he writes, "Our general sense of the war was that a horrible tragedy somehow had the magical effect of getting us free. Its legacy belonged not to us, but to those who reveled in the costume and technology of a time when we were property. Our alienation was neither achieved in independence nor stumbled upon by accident, but produced by American design. The belief that the Civil War wasn't for us was the result of the country's long search for a narrative that can reconcile white people with each other." And he speaks about how in the great period of monument production, both North and South, starting in the 1890s and really peaking in the years towards the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, that there was a conscious effort, essentially, of an erasure of black history in the Civil War experience. And I would say both North and South. And then what we really see 50 years after Gettysburg, and remember, that's about as long after Gettysburg as we are now from Vietnam, and certainly these are times of reconstructions of the memory of that war. But really in that period, we also see the modern construction of whiteness and America as a white nation, excluding from its national narrative people of color, immigrants, and so forth. There's a wonderful book by David Blight called Race in Reunion, which looks quite particularly at how the notion of bringing together the North and the South in a shared vision of imperialism and industrialization, that required that there be a kind of a grand bargain over whiteness and Anglo-Saxonism, and a kind of a erasure of the representation of slavery. And I would say that, in light of the removal of Confederate flag or monuments, and then the question of the York monument, and I had heard that mythology, and I probably repeated it on occasion. And it occurs to me, though, that really there's a larger truth underneath that kind of mythology because of what did happen in York and in Kittery in the early years of the 20th century. that was one of those sites where people who summered up here from the South, we had Thomas Nixon, who wrote The Klansman, became Birth of a Nation, or The Leopard Spots, or Thomas Nelson Page, who summered there, with Harvard professors and other elites from Northeastern institutions who were quite concerned about immigration and about race and the loss of Anglo-Saxonism. And Thomas Nelson Page wrote a famous essay in which he said, we really have to come together to defend whiteness and Anglo-Saxonism, whether it's against Japanese and Chinese in California, or against immigrants in New England, or against the black man in the South, that we need a grand bargain for that endeavor. And from that group in Kittery and York came much of the ideology of colonial revival and the whitening of history. And so the placement of monuments at that time, I think almost the Confederate monuments and the Northern Union monuments might really be a difference without a distinction. They both participated in a whitening of the memory of what the Civil War meant. If you're interested in this story, Donna Cassidy has a really interesting a chapter in her book on the colonial revival, which talks about York and Kittery in this context. And so I want to talk a little bit about memory itself, so what we should really think then about memory, and how these national myths and narratives of memory and race get created. And again, history in America is a funny thing. It is, the past isn't really past, as Faulkner said. I know a man whose grandfather was in the War of 1812. And how many of us here remember seeing Civil War veterans in the 1950s, the last few? All right, I certainly do in Connecticut. The last veterans riding in a parade when I was a Cub Scout, marching with the flag in the early 1950s. So these memories are there, but what happens to them? And I think it has something to do perhaps with the nature of memory. I brought along a memory jug. These were created oftentimes to be put on graves of the deceased. It's a jug, often a whiskey jug, but then it is covered with plaster, and then items that might be related to the deceased or to religious expression, particularly iron for Ogun, and then the mirrors for the flash of the spirit, and then white objects, white buttons, things made out of shells, referencing West African tradition. But the idea of these is that memory is performative, that it isn't monumentalized. There isn't a hegemony of memory, that memory is something the African American community creates as community. And if you think of the art of Kerry James Washington or Carol Walker, it's very particularly that way of trying to undermine the kind of official narrative of memory, so that memory is created by the experience of the community of the present as it understands the past. And I think if the African Burying Ground Monument here, part of the genius in that design is that there's no central narrative to it. There's no authority. You take a journey into memory from the past to the present. It is kind of distemporal. It takes you out of time. And so it's not centered in one interpretation of it. You have to create the experience of that monument for yourself, unlike the Civil War statues where you're kind of told to revere. They're elevated on platforms. They're frozen in time. So I think that kind of notion of journey, contingencies of memory, rather than being memorial, marble, granite, bronze, the kind of frozen pageant of white commemoration of the Civil War. Now I wanted to take my last few minutes by taking us back to the moment at which this kind of bargain was made. And I've handed out copies of a poem by Robert Frost, which I will just point to a couple of passages in. Frost was in Derry, New Hampshire, and participated in a lot of Memorial Day activities. His farmhouse was next to the farmhouse of Mrs. Upton, whose husband had been the first to die from Derry in the Civil War, and after whom the Grand Army of the Republic Post was named. And starting around 1906, 1907, and culminating when he published this poem in 1914, he contemplated a lot what the legacy of the Civil War was going to be. Now, for him, it was personal. He was named Robert Lee Frost after Robert E. Lee by his Copperhead Southern sympathizing father. And after he published this poem, he never used the name Lee in public. Again, up to that point, he'd always signed his poetry Robert Lee Frost, and it became Robert Frost. And if you look at the poem, you see that he's kind of trying to contemplate how is it that, you know, that this legacy of the Civil War, and as he talks about Jefferson's ideal, is being fled by white people at this time in order to preserve their whiteness. Now, Frost, in talking about the black cottage, is referencing the way mold turns an old cottage black. It's because of what is called melanism, this process of transference. Frost knew the word melanism. He thought of titling his most famous book, North of Boston, Melanism, about blackening. It's a blackening of crops. It's also a blackening of chicken. He raised chickens. But I think in the poem you'll see also the danger for a white person of entering the black cottage is that you get blackened by it. And you'll see in the poem there's a kind of a retreat from this black cottage, which is a kind of an insistent memory of what the Civil War was about. I'll just read a couple of parts from it, and I want to see, just you to notice how careful he's talking about representation, about this kind of telescoping sequence of images that distance him from the past of the Civil War, and how this good minister who was his companion, perhaps like one of the good white ministers that King addresses in his letter from a Montgomery jail, is willing to participate in this kind of evisceration of memory and the aestheticizing of it. So just I'll read a few lines from it. We chanced in passing by that afternoon to catch it in a sort of special picture among tar-banded ancient cherry trees, set well back from the road in rank lodged grass. The little cottage we were speaking of, a front with just a door between two windows, fresh painted by the shower of velvet black. We paused, the minister and I, to look. He made as if to hold it at arm's length or put the leaves aside that framed it. Pretty, he said. Come in, no one will care. The path was a vague parting in the grass that led us to a weathered windowsill. We pressed our faces to the pane. You see, he said, everything's as she left it when she died. Her sons wouldn't sell the house or the things in it. They say they mean to come in summer here where there are boys. They haven't come this year. They live so far away. One is out west. It will be hard for them to keep their word. Anyway, they won't have the place disturbed. A buttoned haircloth lounge spread scrolling arms under a crayon portrait on the wall, done sadly from an old daguerreotype. That was the father as he went to war. She always, when she talked about war, sooner or later came and leaned, half dealt against the lounge beside it, though I doubt if such unlifelike lines kept power to stir anything in her after all the years he fell at Gettysburg or Fredericksburg. I ought to know. It makes a difference which. Fredericksburg wasn't Gettysburg, of course, but what I'm getting at is how forsaken a little cottage this has always seemed. So you see, here's that kind of tar. This cottage is the kind of tar baby. If you get too close, you touch something potent in that memory of what it meant, even though if you can't remember if it's Gettysburg or Fredericksburg. And that she had insisted, the top of the next line, that's a hard mystery of Jefferson's. What did he mean? Of course, the easy way to decide it wasn't true, that all men are created equal. But she felt that her husband had to have died for something that had to do about the equality of the races. Well, they turn away and decide to leave the cottage and the memory of the Civil War and the memory of equal rights to rot. But the last gesture is the minister knocks on the side of the house, and bees put their angry heads out, like violence, prophecy of violence lingering there, kind of unspoken, and they look at a blazing kind of apocalyptic sunset as they depart. So that's the bargain, I think, in these monuments, that they really are a monument to forgetting, not to remembering.
I grew up in this little town called Rocky Mount, Virginia, in southwestern Virginia. It's about 2 hours from Greensboro. Have you ever heard of the Martinsville Speedway for racing? It's a little bit there. And, I spent most of my time in this little housing complex called Candlewood. And, when you're in the early 80s and you're a little kid, you get a bike and you just ride all over the place. And you spend most of your time riding bikes everywhere. Driving bikes over in the neighborhood next door or across town or to the dam or wherever you can, and sitting in people's cherry trees and eating their cherries, because little kids don't really understand property value or property tax or property borders. In 1983, I think I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, there was a Klan march in my town that walked right down the center of Main Street, past the statue of Jubal Early. Anybody know who Jubal Early was? Jubal Early was a Confederate lieutenant, I think. And he created this thing right after the Civil War. It's funny, you bring up Coates, and most people read the title of Coates' book, We Were 8 Years in Power, and think, oh, he must be talking about Obama, but he's not. He's talking about the period from 1865 to 1877 when black people actually had some agency over their lives. And that agency manifested itself as black towns, black equality, black politicians, black people in power. And there's this thing called the Warmley Accords that happens in Washington, D.C. at this man named Warmley's house. And Warmley says he's a black business owner, but he's not even involved with this. It's just called the Warmley Accords because it happens at his house. And there was a contested election in 1877 between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. And it was over 20 electoral college votes, including Florida, because damn it, it's always Florida, right? And so Copperhead Democrats had started to come back into power at this point. Most people don't understand that. Most people sort of equate, in politically sort of convenient ways that Democrats were the slaveholders and the Southerners and the creators of Jim Crow, which is right, but it's a little more complicated than that. And so these Copperhead Democrats who own those Confederate, who controlled those electoral college votes, decided to trade away those votes to Rutherford B. Hayes for an end of Reconstruction. And so that ended the 8 years that we were in power. And it was after this time that we start getting Jim Crow laws and vagrancy laws and a number of other things. And you get Confederate Democrats who are like, I'm not a fan of slavery. I would never bring slavery back. That's not something I'd be interested in. The war was not necessarily about slavery. It wasn't about slavery. And it wasn't about slavery for the Union. It wasn't about slavery for Lincoln. It was about keeping the Union together. But for the South, it was absolutely about slavery. When you look at Mississippi, which was the first state, which was one of the richest states in the Union before slavery and the poorest state afterwards, you can understand why they were fighting. They were fighting for their rights. And South Carolina was another one. South Carolina actually had all black towns and black power centers. So the reason I tell you about the Klan March and going by Jubal Early, because Jubal Early had this idea. It's called the Lost Cause. Anybody ever heard of the Lost Cause? Most people don't know this. The Lost Cause was this movement among Confederate Democrats to make the Civil War about something other than slavery. It was a concerted effort. They wrote books about it. They wrote essays about it. They basically proliferated the knowledge in the South that the Civil War was about taxes and tariffs, which were handled in 1845, but it was about taxes and tariffs. It was about states' rights, where in reality, it couldn't have been about states' rights because in 1857 they passed the Fugitive Slave Act, and one of the reasons that the Southern Confederacy seceded is because the federal government was not requiring northern states to return federal property. So it was actually against states' rights. So what they started to do was to change the idea from anything but slavery. And some of these things were this reclaiming of the South as this noble sort of enterprise, and that we were only destroyed because of the brutish nature of the North and their overpowering and brutish ideas. We were genteel, and our slaves were happy. They were happy, and we have proof. It's called Gone with the Wind. We're gonna go get those We're going to make sure those Yankees can't do anything to you, Miss Scarlett, which is just a jarring sort of thing to watch if you are a black person watching that movie. But that book and The Klansman, which became Birth of the Nation, were sort of the ending sort of like periods of what happens at the end of Reconstruction. What was Reconstruction? It was the fulfillment of the lost cause. Most people don't know that on the books right now in Washington, there is a law to create a Mammy statue on the Mall of Washington, on the Washington Mall. And Mammy was this idea because one of these Southern politicians read Gone with the Wind and was like, we need to build a statue to this black woman who loved her family and took care of her slaves and took care of her people and took care of the master's children, not realizing that Mammy is a character that never really existed. She was not even, most women that took care of children weren't women, they were 12-year-old girls or younger, and they would be beaten if the kids soiled themselves or if they weren't potty trained. So people had they had composed this idea of what the South looked like. And this is when we also get monuments, these monuments to these Southern generals. Because right after the Civil War, most people forget that it was illegal to display the Confederate flag. It was illegal to put that outside. It was illegal to put those things out there in the world. And so there wasn't anything after that, but until when Copperhead Democrats, and I say Copperhead Democrats as opposed to Democrats because there were definitely Democrats in the South that were not Copperhead Democrats. That's why you have in the South, you've got Southern Baptists and Union Baptists. Most people don't realize that those were the church split because there was a separation between the Baptists, where some of them were supporting the Union, some were supporting the Confederacy. But those ideas about so that's ingrained in our history now, right? So it's like you seem balanced when you say, well, the Civil War was about a little bit more than what people were talking about when you don't really just confront it. And it's usually people reading the documents of the lost cause. They're reading the ideas of the lost cause, which are embedded in what we are talking about right now. All that idea is about, and so this is where it becomes complicated, right? Because you've got a generation or a couple of generations of people who have been reading these ideas about the lost cause and taking them as fact. And so you have some people like, for example, my son's godfather, who carries a Confederate flag in his pocket. He doesn't think he's racist. He thinks he's celebrating heritage. He's read the ideas of the lost cause that have been embedded in history books over the course of the last 100 years or so, and he's sort of taken to his idea that, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. My wife and I took our children to my daughter's on a trip from across country. We mostly spent it in the Southwest, in the South, and we went to the first White House of the Confederacy. And so we go in and it's a really amazing place. If you ever get a chance, it's right down it's actually like within walking distance of the Dexter Parsonage where Dr. King was the minister during the Montgomery bus boycotts. And you can walk between those two, just don't go in August, because if you walk between those two in August, you will melt. So we go into the first White House of the Confederacy, and there's a guy in Confederate garb, and he's giving us a tour, and the docent's very nice. My wife told me I could not ask questions. And so he goes through this whole process of explaining the Civil War and the ideas, and then I start hearing lost cause. I start hearing the lost cause. It starts to creep into what he's talking about. And he goes, the Confederate Constitution doesn't say anything about slavery. And I go to put my hand up, my wife puts it down. Because if you read the Constitution of the Confederacy, it does probably two or three things that the United States, our Constitution doesn't do. It's actually a stronger document in a lot of ways. It actually clarifies a lot of things within states' rights. It clarifies some specific powers that are dealt to the federal government versus the state. But then it makes two, I think, significant changes. And if you've ever read it, these are the changes that I think it makes. One of them is that it gets the president 1 6-year term, which I think is probably a good idea. And the other thing is that it makes slavery legal. It implicitly says slavery is legal. And that guy, that docent, is completely affected by this guy whose monument I walked past every day when I was a kid, Jubal Early. about this idea that, and that monument, again, guess when it was built? Between 1877 and 1920, during the Lost Cause. So the Lost Cause has effectively permeated every part of our understanding about the history of what happened in the South. Even in the language that we use when we talk about black people leaving the South in the 1920s, we call it the Great Migration. Any other group of people, we would call them refugees because they're leaving the South because of white terrorism. They're not staying there because, it was a concerted effort. The laws that are created, the way in which we create criminals were specifically designed to attack slaves. Vagrancy laws, not having a job is because we want to put you back in the chain gang and put you back to work. If you don't have a job, then you're shiftless. People didn't understand that people start to leave the South. Immediately, the roads are packed with slaves because people are going out to find their family and their lost loved ones. That you can see in newspapers up until the 1920s and 30s. People are still looking for their lost loved ones. Because the Lost Cause has permeated into everything that we talk about when we talk about history, if you ever hear somebody say the Civil War was not about slavery, have them read secession documents. The first line in almost every single secession document is that we are beholden to the institution of slavery. Every single document. I got into a flame war on Facebook. Anybody know what those are? Flame wars, when you're like on Facebook and you start, I know it doesn't happen all the time. I know it's like Facebook is a really like rational conversation sort of a place. But I got into this flame war on Facebook with this guy who I called him, in my mind he's lost cause mentality. He's got that idea and all of that stuff that's been written about the lost cause embedded in what he's thinking. And he goes, we're going back and forth. And I as a historian, I'm a cartoonist, but I'm also a historian. I usually just respond to those things with actual documents. I don't it's not what, some, Harvard professor wrote in 1970 about the Civil War. I give you what those actual people wrote at the time because primary documents trump Harvard professors in the 70s every single day of the week. So I send him the documents. He says it was about taxes and tariff. I sent him the law that changes taxes and tariff in 1845. He said, well, it was about states' rights. And then I sent him the arguments that the South were making about the federal government returning their property, forcing the states to do something. He says, well, it's not about the war. And he goes, and I send him some information. And this guy gets really smart. He was a brilliant lost causer. He sends me something that Lincoln said about it not being about slavery. And so I'm like, okay. I start to type and I'm like, oh, he almost got me. He almost got me because I almost started to argue that it was about slavery. But I realized what he was doing was he was telling me the people who did not own slaves didn't really care about the slavery. But the people who did. The people who were. He was entrenched in this idea about the lost cause. And it's complicated now, right? Because we're dealing with people who have, in Charlottesville and a number of other places across the country who are, some people, not all of them, but there are some people that are entrenched with the idea that the Confederacy and the Confederate flag is heritage because they're basically indoctrinated into the idea of the lost cause. And then there's some people who know that that's BS, so for lack of a better word, they know this BS. They just want their white supremacy symbols up there, including the Confederate flag. If you ever get into an idea about someone with the Confederate flag, just ask them what the guy who created the Confederate flag said, because he basically says that it is a flag to show that white people are the dominant race on the planet. His exact words. We need this flag for this. So. Just when you're having these arguments, if you find yourself on Facebook, just keep in mind that some people have been indoctrinated by the lost cause, and it's going to take a lot to sort of pull them back out of that trench.
Hi there, can you folks hear me okay? I just want to say a quick thanks to Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire for setting this up and for the other T's. I think it's great that you are a statewide organization now, so congratulations for that. That's a terrific way to have an organization really as a memorial to keep these stories alive and to keep this, this heritage alive and to help set things into context. Thank you. And just note, I saw earlier this week, or last week, sorry, Shadows Fall North, terrific film. If you haven't seen it, it's really good. Jerry Ann came to my hometown of Hancock last week to show that, and we had a full house and a terrific reception. So, my bit in this is quite different from the previous panelists here. My own introduction to Black history in New Hampshire came about from my habit of being in the woods. It really came in the forest, where there are few monuments and few markers. And there are, in my neck of the woods in southwestern New Hampshire, a small town called Hancock. It's just north of Monadnock a bit. There are plenty of cellar holes. And do you know what cellar holes are? They're old foundations. So, and sort of honing in closer to where I am, in the southwestern part of Hancock, I have the privilege of being next to quite a bit of protected land, somewhere in the order of 10 to 15,000 acres of protected lands, protected by various conservation organizations. And so I've lived there forever and have always wandered those hills. And sometimes because I hunt, and sometimes just because I like to explore, and I'm often off the trails, just in the woods. And so as I did that, I would come across cellar holes, and my curiosity would be piqued. And I needed to know who lived where and when, and who these people were, exactly what the families were, what they were like, what they did. And so that would lead me to the usual sources, the town histories, old maps, archives, census figures, and things like that. And I would have maps, and I would spreadsheets, everything. I was pretty geeky about it. And as I did this, I had a lot of families that I sort of kept track of in the past. But there were 5 or 6 cellar holes in particular that I kept coming back to, and that kept intriguing me. And as I looked at the census figures, it said that the people who lived here were of mixed race, according to the census. They were free people of color. And these 5 cellar holes were all linked by one family, the Due family, D-U-E. And so I had to find out their story, figure out who they were. And they were associated with another fellow named Jack Ware, who, as the story goes, was captured as a boy in Africa and brought over here as a slave and was enslaved for I don't know how long, a period in his life, somehow gained his freedom and ended up in the hills of the outskirts of Hancock and in the late 1770s with this family, the Due family. They were very closely associated, I could tell that. So the Dews lived in Hancock for 3 or 4 generations, from the late 1770s to 1860s, I think. And as I went through the stories, it kind of led me to church archives. This is just just a little bit of it. It's I don't know if you've seen archives in libraries and so on, but it's an old book, and it's the written account of the history of the church, basically, by the pastors at the time. So I got into that, and I unearthed the stories that aren't in our town histories. There's no monuments, there's no markers, there's no mention of them in the town, and it's largely erased and forgotten, as I'm sure people wanted to be forgotten. But it was the story of some very hard times endured by this Due family. And I don't have time to tell the whole story, But I can tell you that there were several episodes involving the church, the Hancock Congregational Church, and the pastors who led the church, Reverend Reed Page and Reverend Archibald Burgess. And between the 1790s and 1830s, this involved several episodes where various family members were charged with things like adultery, defying the church, not reflecting penitence, and ultimately several of these members of the Dew family were excommunicated and cast aside from the church. And these were usually in very public and very humiliating ways. These were, church hearings that are pretty much like town meetings today, as you might imagine. So, and there was one woman in particular, Betsy Dew Raisey, who strongly defied the church and stood up for herself and stood up against, the all-powerful church in town and the Reverend Archibald Burgess. And she had refused to take back her adulterous husband, was the charge leveled against her. But the real charge was standing up against the church and defying Reverend Burgess. And she was ultimately excommunicated. But in the process that led up to that, it was 2.5 years of public and very emotionally wrenching hearings where she stood up against the church. It was awful. It was messy. And it was public. So life eventually went on for Betsy Dew Raisey and the rest of her family. And she lost, in the process of this, the Dew family lost what modest wealth they had. And life, like I said, went on. That family eventually, I don't know how to say it, but they basically became white, and ultimately lost track of their black heritage until one member who, in the 1980s, as this woman retired, she had been a Mormon, and she went and found her family history, went to Hancock, and discovered her black heritage, or her mixed race. So I don't know anything beyond that. But anyway, life went on for them, and life went on too for Archibald Burgess, the pastor in the church, who ultimately became vigorously opposed to the anti-slavery movement that was coming, spreading across, New Hampshire and New England, and he was among several pastors around New Hampshire. I'm sure you know about this, David, that really opposed the anti-slavery movement. And there were some who favored abolition, but Reverend Archibald Burgess was not one of them, and he was reviled by the anti-slavery press to the point where, this is like in the 1840s, he was described as being the fat pig, Reverend Archibald Burgess, and other kind of disparaging ways to describe him. So in 1841, as the anti-slavery movement kept sort of spreading across New Hampshire and other parts, there would be anti-slavery conventions, and the Reverend Henry C. Wright would come to speak in Hancock, and he was a fairly well-known abolitionist. And before he came, Reverend Burgess stood up in front of the church and warned his parishioners not to attend Reverend Wright's talk, his sermon, and if they did, they would be cast out of the church. And so, of course, several members of the congregation did attend and were fairly vocal about that, and they were excommunicated from the church, kicked out, and in a very public and emotionally wrenching way, too. But they stood up against him. And then the next year, 1842, there was another anti-slavery convention in Hancock with kind of an all-star cast of characters. Nathaniel Rogers, who was editor of the Herald of Freedom newspaper here in New Hampshire, in Concord, Parker Pillsbury, and Stephen Foster, and the Hutchinson Family Singers. They all came to Hancock. They came to other towns, but and did these conventions too. But when they came to Hancock, Reverend Burgess did the same thing. You will not attend this, and if you do, there will be consequences. And he encouraged the youth of the church to show up and give them a hard time, give the anti-slavery folks a hard time, and they did. And it was basically an angry mob. They threw rocks at the church right through the windows. They roughed up the speakers. They interrupted the speakers. They went right up to the speakers and stood behind them and argued with them right in front of everybody. So it was pretty ugly. And similar scenes happened throughout New Hampshire and other parts of New England. But what happened in Hancock was not unusual in the ways that people of color were mistreated and things were forgotten. And you know, as I said earlier, there's nothing in the town history to refer to these two tracks, either the Dew story or the Antislavery Conventions. Really nothing. There's nothing at the cemetery except the stones, the tombstones and headstones of Archibald Burgess and the Dew family, or what's left of them. And the townspeople largely don't know about this. And the few who do know about it, some of them are still fairly uncomfortable with the topic. And with me telling the story sometimes as I go. I do sort of cellar hole walks where I will talk about it. And it's a touchy topic in Hancock, even to this day. Some people don't like it to be brought up. Hancock is like many other New Hampshire towns, but it's like a Currier and Ives town. It's got lots of pretty white buildings all on Main Street, and it's very harmonious, and this topic does sort of upset that narrative. And it's still a touchy thing. So, at any rate, I think about the theme of this talk, and I think about an author who lives in town, Howard Mansfield, and he wrote a book called In the Memory House, and it's about how we remember history and what we choose to remember, what we choose to forget, and sometimes we build monuments to the things we want to remember and how we want to remember them. But he also says something I thought sounded right. And he said, some things disappear so well that ultimately they're completely forgotten. Nothing is left. But, I think it's talks like this and Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire that helps us keep some of these memories alive.
So thank you so much. Before I open up the discussion to the floor, did you want to show an image,
No,
Joel?
no, it's fine. We'll just go ahead.
Okay. I just want, just in case they didn't know what it is you do and what you want to talk
Let's see a
about.
picture too.
Just-
Come on, man. Yeah. Don't be shy.
So when thinking about this, I initially was going to show some images from a book, my book, Strange Fruit: Uncelebrated Narratives from Black History, Volume 2, which just came out this month. And I was going to talk about Victor Green and the Green Book. Is anybody familiar with the Green Book? Yeah. Yes. So the Green Book was a book that was created by a man named Victor Green in New York for black people to travel. So after the refugees left the South to go north, when cars started becoming affordable for everybody, they made these books. They were trying to go back down south. And so now that you're no longer down south, where do you stop to get gas? Which town should you stay out of? And most people thought that those towns were only occurred when you hit the Mason-Dixon line. But when I moved here from Boston in 2002, I discovered something really interesting. I don't know if you guys know this, but racism exists above the Mason-Dixon line too. So these towns, there would be sundown towns. Anybody know what a sundown town is? So a sundown town was a town where black people weren't allowed in the town after sundown. And so Victor Green started compiling a list of these places that people could go, and he put it together in a book called The Green Book for the Negro Motorist. This is the story of the Green Book, and it starts with the family driving. from New York to the South, and the son in the back has to go to the bathroom, and they keep thinking about where they could stop, and there's no place for them to stop as they go, until finally they just stop in the woods, and the little boy goes to the bathroom. And it was a common experience for Black people. This is a portrait of Victor Green. So Victor Green he compiled a list of all these places that Black people could go. And basically what he says in this very sort of like even-handed way to avoid embarrassment, because that was sort of a way in which he could talk about it, as opposed to what would normally happen, which is these are some of the places that people couldn't go. And then Victor Green's book made it safe for people to go in a number of different places. And so, because not planning could be inconvenient, where you run out of class. You can see where it says no Negroes, no Mexicans. And this one is just some people standing outside with a shotgun, and then this is a Klan rally, and the people are flying away. And so when he put together this book, he put together a number of different places for people to go, and also he also incorporated all places where you could go that were all Black resorts. This one's called Idlewild, which was in Michigan. And so you can see here, Black people were banned from many public beaches, and if they would go to some beaches, it would still be a problem. And so when you went to Idlewild, that was no longer an issue. And I talk about this a little bit in the beginning of the book. In the foreword, I talk about the idea that, Black people are going to these places not to be exclusionary, but to actually go to a place where you can check race at the door. There are people in this room that I'm sure you understand what it's like to be the diversity when you walk into a room. And I think that, because we wear our immigration on our skin, that means we wear our immigration directly out front. It doesn't mean that we're not any less American. But because we wear our immigration on our skin, because you can see the fact that my family came from a different place, it becomes an issue in America, and it's it relates to the Lost Cause and to Bacon's Rebellion. I can talk about this for a couple hours, but Jerry Ann's going to kick me off in a minute. This is just a book about this is the story of the Green Book, and this is most of those places were sort of done away with after segregation, but. There are those people who still lament the idea of these all Black anything. And I think it's because, we still live in a society where Black people have to sort of have that conversation about race on a regular basis. Like, it's not my job to teach you about race, sort of a thing, but we have to. Because if we don't do it, who's going to do it? And I think that having, understanding what the Green Book was, which was a place to find safety, but also to find places where you could be, you could exist outside of that. To not have to go. I have a friend who puts together these Black comic book conventions all over the country. And people are like, why are you going to do that? It's very exclusionary. But you see a Black mother walking in there looking for comics, and you understand that she's looking for, she doesn't have to ask, are there stories in here that look like my kids? You know what I mean? Like, is there stories that we can look up to? And I don't think people have a clear understanding about how much that representation is important. So that's just a little bit about the Green Book. And I have a few copies of my first 3 books as well. So like I said, if you guys are interested, I have some copies, and then I can take your name and send you an order form for other ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're opening up the floor for discussion, and if you don't know, we had in Kittery one house on the Green Book, the Rock Rest, in case you don't know. It's also part of the Black Heritage Trail.
Hi, thank you so much. On the theme of comics and Black history, with the Black Panther movie coming out this weekend, could you talk about that as a potential place for social monuments or stories, or how do we create, I don't know, how stories fit in comics? And
So when you meet somebody for the first time, whenever you meet somebody, you share your story, right? You talk about where you've been, who you know, where you went to school, what you like, what you don't like. And that's sharing little bits and pieces of your humanity. And when you share those stories, you get a better understanding of what it's like to be that person. So you have empathy for them. When I went to see the Black Panther, I started to tear up in there. I'm sure a lot of black people did, because like how many opportunities do we get to see positive role models of black people on television or in movies or in media that aren't magical Negroes like Bagger Vance? Does everybody know what the magical Negro trope is? It's when you have this black person who has some like sassy wisdom or ethnic wisdom that they impart on the main character so that they can go off and save the world. Like our only existence is for that one individual. And I look at representations like the Black Panther and any of the movies with black casts. I mean, one of the ways to think about it is look at what they do in Europe, in England specifically. They just put black people in television and it's not a thing. You know, it's not like a conversation. Like it's not like some social commentary. It's just like, oh, there's a black character over here and he's going to go out and fight zombies or to solve the mystery or do whatever. It's not like a thing, but in the United States, because we're fighting this uphill battle, it is, because we have black people, people of color, minority people, LGBT people have a relationship with America. And relationships are built on balances. You know, you make positive deposits, you make negative deposits. And in 1877, you know, black people had about a $500 negative deposit. And after the end of slavery, we get down to $250, but we're still negative. And then after 1877, it goes back up to maybe about 300. So we're taking negative deposits. Then we get the birth of the nation and the lost cause and Blackfoot. So you're taking all these things out. And then in the civil rights movement, we get another big chunk comes out, right? So we're about $100 negative right now. So we're still at about $100 negative. We're probably like maybe $50, but we still haven't even got to a place where we're equal yet. So we can't, until we start, you know, movies like the Black Panther, any movies with positive black roles for black males, women, you know, like to understand that those things make positive deposits into that relationship until we get back to equal. And once we get to equal, that's when we can say, well, that's when we can talk about fairness. Do you know what I mean? That's when we can say, oh, it's not fair that you have all these black characters in there, because we can't talk about that yet because we're still negative. We still have detriment.
Can I just add something to that? What Joel has said so well is that this is why it's so important to make visible the history, as Eric has talked about, or what Jerry Ann did with the monument for Harriet Wilson over in Milford, or what's been done here in Portsmouth. But, you know, so I don't know how many, what do you think, about 3 or 4 centuries, maybe they'll catch up? But in the meantime, the other monuments have to be deconstructed. And the narratives have to be deconstructed, because the power there is so intense, and it has been in place now for, you know, the lost cause narrative it won. It's been revivified in the last few years. It's been in place for 150 years. And so that has to be contested.
Yep.
That has to be broken. It has to be broken apart if people are going to be able to look at these monuments and see them for what they are.
And I think it's important in a kind way to do that, because like I said, there are people who really believe that it's their heritage, and like you have to like talk to them and just like, you know what, I understand, but you realize that this isn't real, you know, like this isn't a real thing. And you have to be, you know, it has to be kindness, because like my son's godfather, like what am I going to tell him? Like, you're a racist? You know what I mean? Like, doesn't work, you know, like it doesn't work if he hits a wall. So.
I thought that when you won a war, you were supposed to control the narrative. How did the North cede the entire narrative to the South?
Well, you know, I think Joel described the politics of it, and I think there was a politics and a big money of that time, but I think it was also a cultural war. And I think that, you know, as troublesome as it may be, I think a lot of writers decided that whether they're North or South, I mean, how many black characters are there in the novels of Henry James? Okay? You know, Robert Frost, you It's been described by Derek Walcott, the Nobel laureate, that the unforgivable sin of Robert Frost was never to say a word about the civil rights struggle of the 1950s, when he was the most famous writer in America. So I think that, in my work and what I've suggested here is that we really have to burrow down into these individuals and understand what was at stake for them in their whiteness.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm feeling edified. I was listening to BBC last night. I can't tell you what time it was because I just woke up and that's when I hit the button and I listened to BBC. And there was a program on, and it's one of their history shows, and it talked about how this monument thing is an American phenomenon. And they talked about the argument of having decided having these monuments to the generals and all this. Yes, they got Lenin and they got Raleigh, but they don't have the preponderance in every little town. And they were talking about, and I fell back to sleep, so I'm going to ask your opinion on this. They were talking about where does it stop? What about Jefferson, who was a president? And then I fell asleep. So I'm wondering what you guys think about that.
I would have probably fallen asleep too. Yeah, monument. The monument thing is, it was a concerted effort by, like the sons of the Confederate, daughters of the Confederate Confederacy, like these people who really they were putting federal money in these little towns. So they snuck those laws into a lot of different things. Like you have to, it was pork barreling basically. We're going to put people to work. We're going to put this local guy to work. We're going to put together the lost cause. So it was that's how we got the preponderance of them. The idea of where it stops is, I don't know. History is not black or white. It's gray. And I think they're the people who want history to be black and white. They want Jefferson to be absolutely 100% a Renaissance man and really interesting and smart and sort of cultured, but at the same time he was a slave owner. You know what I mean? It's a complicated thing. It's like the different, I always take this to reading 12 Years a Slave versus watching the movie 12 Years a Slave, because in the movie, just talk about complicated character, the overseer was a complicated character in the book. The overseer felt it was his responsibility to take care of the slaves. That doesn't feed our narrative of what an overseer is supposed to be. But in the movie, he was different, right? He was like the stereotypical overseer. And so those kind of things are, really difficult. It's difficult to understand that that one slave master that he had in the book was a kind, gentle, decent man that probably wouldn't have owned slaves had he known that there was another way. It's a complicated thing. So, applying our historical understandings to the morality of people from, 200 years ago is difficult and probably problematic on our part. But to say where it stops, I don't know. It's okay to have the monument as long as we have the conversation. Do you know what I mean? As long as there's a conversation, they're doing that in Stone Mountain, Georgia, where they're having a conversation. They're literally just not only are going to have the Stone Mountain, which is a monument to the Confederacy, but they're putting a monument to Dr. King there, and they're going to have a conversation about it.
And I will, just let's note that there's a very revolutionary strain in American life that goes back to the Puritans against the notion of idolatry and smashing idols. The American Revolution, they attacked the houses, they attacked the property of the loyalists. And so I think that there's a recognition that the powers that be place great credence in the value of these monuments, and they are meant to be tools of oppression, as Joel said. I see Marita here, and I was down in Cuba a few months ago, and Fidel has not allowed there to be any statue of Fidel in the country. He would never allow it, and no schools named after him, no streets, and it was he knew if there were statues that go up, they could come down. They could come down, and so I'm a historian too, and I like monuments, material culture, and there's histories there, but maybe we cannot progress as a nation until we understand that much of this has to go. No more. That some of this has to go, or else people cannot walk down their own streets and see a landscape that is not built on a message of oppression. And it's going to be painful. And I have suggested in my own talk today that maybe it's not just the Confederate monuments, maybe it's the other Civil War monuments too.
So I just had a comment on the why the North kind of ceded the narrative to the South, and it makes me think of inconvenient truth, because at the time, those in power in the North were running the cotton mills and the factories here in Lawrence and up and down the river. They needed that cotton, and if they couldn't get the cotton, then the folks up here wouldn't have the nice cotton shirts and all the things and the jobs. So you really didn't look under that rock too much. It worked. It worked.
Getting back to the monuments, so it sounds to me like you would not favor correcting the language that accompanies the monuments, so that if they are idolizing people of oppression, that's explained, and that explains the history of the people who wanted them there, but it also explains the crime of oppression. You would rather tear down all the monuments? I think it's a valid point.
I personally wouldn't tear down all the monuments. I think that when you forget where things are, you forget why we got here. Just this morning we were getting ready to watch Tom and Jerry, and I remember thinking to my mom, my mom's over there, I was thinking to myself, like, we're going to put the 40s Tom and Jerry on, but I wonder if they've, like, censored it, because they censor it a lot of the times. And I think when you censor stuff, as opposed to having a conversation about it, you basically erase the history of it. And, when you erase the history of it, then you get kids like I had a student in one of my classes who was like, I'm going to come dressed as you, Joel, for Halloween. This is a college student. He's like, I'm going to wear a blackface. And I'm like, don't. Like, let me explain this to you. Because he had no idea. And the reason that he had no idea is because that history is erased. Like, people don't understand what that's like anymore. Like, they don't understand what we had to do in order to get that to stop. And so we erase those things and pretend like they never happened, and then people bring that stuff back. And you need that. I think the monuments should stay. I just think we should have a real clear conversation about those things.
Yeah, and I'm not advocating we take hammers from here and go start smashing the Civil War monument out on Islington Street. But who's going to decide? I mean, I think we have to go right back to the start of the conversation and not say just because it's there, it gets to stay. And who's going to decide what gets to be written? And how do we know what that message will be? And I just think we have to get around it's us against this or this monument against that or so on. And what I was trying to do in my talk is say we've got to rethink what memory means and who owns it.
It's just like a powerful message that if you go to Robert E. Lee Elementary School and, some, white kid, some town that's all mostly white kids, and you actually have to have a conversation about who Robert E. Lee was. Do you know what I mean? Like what kind of a powerful conversation, you can have a balanced conversation about that as opposed to just pretend like it doesn't exist.
I grew up in New Jersey, and then we spent about 8 years in Connecticut before I retired. And we made a decision to go south. We never lived in the South before, so we ended up in South Carolina, Beaufort, which is on the coast. And when we moved there in 2007, I believe this is correct, the state capitol still had the Confederate flag at the top of the Capitol building, I guess under the state flag or on top of the state flag. I'm not sure which way it was. And it took a few years later before that finally came down. I think it was largely due to business pressures.
No, it came out in 2013 or 14, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it was really
And so that was flying. And we also learned things. There was an undercurrent living there that we just sensed, this is not all happy faces in the porches with the people drinking their juleps and stuff. And the most visible thing we witnessed is the Memorial Day parades. One year was white, the next year it was black. And I communicated with the mayor of Beaufort, who's still the mayor today, and I said, what is up? He says, oh, this has been this way for years, John. And then, you know, we just have two different groups organizing these parades. I said, yeah, right. So, I presume a lot of you never lived in the South. Well, I don't, that's why we're here.
It's not the weather.
Just before I pass this on, because in Russia, what they do with their the problematic narrative monuments is they've created a park and created a counter-narrative along with that. And in Germany, they don't allow those Nazi symbols or those figures at all. So, you know, where do we fall in that narrative?
Interesting. Yeah.
David mentioned Cuba and the lack of not only monuments but photographs or any acknowledgement to Fidel in Cuba. He absolutely didn't want them. You'll see Jose Marti, who is a very well-known Cuban poet, all over. He's in the schools, and I didn't even know who he was until I went to Cuba for the first time. But one of the monuments that I saw there, which I found extraordinary and very different perspective on the world, was a monument to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And according to the plaque, they were being acknowledged, and they were acknowledged, and that they were assassinated by the U.S. government. So you think about history and how people look at history in a very different way. So maybe some of our own monuments could have information added to them with a different perspective on it, not necessarily taking them down, but expanding what is on there so that other viewpoints can be expressed.
Interesting. Yeah.
Oh, there was one here. Okay, I'll do this in order. 1, 2, 3. All right? According to how your hands went up.
So I am responding to a couple of things that have struck me about this conversation, and then you all can respond to my response. So thank you. This has just been illuminating. So I have one comment about the BBC and talking about America and the fact that they still have a monarchy. They still have a royal family, which seems a little bit odd to kind of speculate on what's going on in America. So in terms of monumental, getting stuck, I would say that's pretty stuck. So not that I don't like following the royals in their lives, but a monarchy. Okay, so and in line with that, okay, so they ended enslavement much earlier than we did in America. And when I give these tours, I'm amazed at how little I know about our history in the world. And so I get an education when I give the Sankofa tours. And one bit of education I got is that they ended enslavement because they paid the lords and owners of the enslaved persons for their property. They never paid the enslaved persons. They paid the lords, the owners. So to be proud of the fact that that ended earlier than it ended here, you gotta look behind the curtain of what that means. And when the triangle trade sort of came to an end in 1809, another learning on the tour, anyone who hasn't taken this tour, it's given by several different people through the course of the summer. Take it because it's fascinating, and you might teach us something in the process, because I always learn from the people I give these tours to. So this triangle trade comes to an end, and the US and England are policing so that they return ships full of enslaved people back to Africa. But what's happening with enslavement as it continues in the United States, tragically, it becomes a matter of procreation. So while you cannot any longer purchase slaves from Africa or the African countries, you can have your enslaved people have children, and then they become your property too. So, you know, I'm thinking about the monuments of our mind and the way in which we ignore what's going on inside ourselves and make up these myths around, well, enslavement was maybe better in the North. It wasn't, you know, it just wasn't. And So I share that, and I guess I would ask this question of the monument of the mind for anybody who wants to. I guess that's sort of what we're talking about in a way today too. So those are my comments, and before Jerry Ann takes the mic away from me, I guess my question would be more on the line of, it continues, and I don't know that it's an answerable question, the what do we do part, and I appreciate you so much, Eric, for giving the tours of the cellar holes. That's, lifting those individuals who are forgotten is probably the most important thing that we can do. It's a more constructive building block, I think, than anything else we can do. So those are my comments.
You know, Eric's story, I think, is so important because it shows how active the expulsion of black families was in New Hampshire in the 1830s and 40s, precisely because they were worried about free communities of color and escaped slaves from settling in the state. And then another movement was the 1890 to 1910 anti-tramp movement. And you can read about this. There's actually a novel written about in New Hampshire and the fear of black tramps. And so that was another period in which African Americans were driven from the state.
Hi. So I grew up in the South, so I'm going to just comment a little bit, and then I have an observation. I'd like to know what you think about it. So I grew up in Florida in the 70s in an integrated school, and there were beaches that we knew you don't go to because that was the black beach. You know, you just didn't go. But also, it was a matter of pride for some of my friends when they got their first cars. They put their Confederate license plate on the front. You don't have to have two plates in Florida. So the experience growing up for me is probably very different than the experience of someone growing up in Connecticut or something. And it's part of the culture. I didn't know about the lost cause till I was older and moved out of the state. But I think that we don't realize the same way that we feel things, people have been brought up feeling something or understanding something, and it's part of their culture. And that's such a difficult thing to change. I think maybe that's why you have to almost chip at things away, like with drops of water and erode it, because it's so ingrained from when you're very young. And until you get knowledge, and I'm happy that I moved out of Florida, until you get knowledge and you get experience of different people, you don't have any other perspective than what's in your community. So I think it's just a comment. But also, so I went to Fort McAllister, which I don't know if anybody knows. It's one of the only earthen forts from the Civil War, and it's in Georgia, so I'm a big Civil War history buff. And when I was there, there was a gentleman who was obviously with some sort of group of maybe Confederate historians or Confederate something. He saw we had Vermont plates, and he came up and he had his CD and literature, and he's like, have you thought about the war? Have you learned? You haven't learned. And he, very much putting out, I guess, lost cause propaganda. This is just a couple years ago. This is me going, on a historical site. So it's just so pervasive, and I want your thoughts of things like Civil War sites and forts, and it's a different kind of monument that you don't want to take away, but how, I'm looking at that in a completely different way than this gentleman, and I just want to know your thoughts on things like battlefields and historical sites, and those, how do we interpret that, and how can we use those as learning tools?
Yeah, that's hard, because I think because the lost cause, narrative is so entrenched in what it's entrenched in history books. It's in, people don't want to talk about it, and it's like, just because we have a conversation about it doesn't mean that I'm saying that white people are bad. You know what I mean? Like, it's not. Like, that's the thing that I think people think, that if we bring this stuff up, then we're making an argument that there's one group that's better than the other. And it's not that. It's like, let's just have a real clear conversation about it. Were there some people living in the South who were anti-slavery? Yeah, but the power structure wasn't. Were there black people who fought in the Confederate Army? Yeah, that's the truth. We have to confront these things with facts and an understanding, but I think it's really important, specifically with the Civil War, is to only use primary documents, because so much has been written about the Civil War after the fact that it's all eroded. People will, like somebody will send me a blog, like this blog says, I'm like, I don't really care what this blog says, because Mississippi said this in 1860. This is what they said. This is what South Carolina said. This is what Lincoln said at this time. This isn't my interpretation of what this guy said. It's actually what they said. And keeping that in mind, and it's subtle, right? It's subtle, but it's also like you have to be kind. It's like, it's a lot of ways, it's like telling your kids Santa Claus doesn't exist. Do you know what I mean? You don't just rip the Band-Aid off and go, you know what? Surprise! Magic ain't a thing. You know what I mean? It's like a slow sort of well, this is the way it might be, until they get to a place where they can handle it. I think we have to do that with the people who are really, entrenched with the lost cause. You have to go, yeah, look at the Confederate flag, and then later I'll tell you about what Mississippi said. You know what I mean? That's the way you have to, it's got to be gentle, because going and pulling down the monument on our own is sort of abrupt, and it's making people confront stuff that they're uncomfortable about. And I think we have to be more gentle than that. Because ultimately we want to live in a society where everybody's part of it. Ultimately we want to, and this was controversial, but ultimately we want to enfold the white supremacists into everywhere else. We want them to have changed, right? We want them to have come back to the fold and goes, you know what? That was wrong for me to think that. So we can't, and how do you get to them? You have to do it piece by piece. You have to do it, bit by bit. And it's like sharing stories. It's, making that connection, being empathetic and understanding where they're coming from. And then getting to that, bit by bit. It's slow and steady, but we got to do it. It's got to be gentle.
If I can just jump in for a second too. I have to give yet another plug for Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire for helping us think about monuments in a different way, too, by having this trail throughout New Hampshire, and Kittery, too, right? These are places that are out of the way. New Hampshire is a very rural state, and I think people identify with what's local very strongly. And when folks in, for instance, Newport, New Hampshire, see that there was a place called Coit's Mountain, where there was a very small black community there, and they hear the story about this Coit's Mountain and the people who lived there, I think that will be very compelling. And other sites along the trail, like Canaan, New Hampshire, Noyes Academy, which was taken off its foundation by 100 oxen because it had students of both black and white. And in Milford, with the Harriet Wilson House. I think, this will really help spread a legacy that will help inform and educate people that not all is black and white, that history is shades of color and open to interpretation. And we need to think about the context then and as it is today.
Bob Chase. A couple of quick comments from the late 40s, early 50s. I grew up in Durham, which was a totally white town in the late 40s, to my knowledge anyway, except I was on the cutting room floor of Louis de Rochemont's movie. So, but that was essentially white people playing black people. Okay, yeah. All right. Secondly, my father was at UNH. Korean War, the family picked up and moved to Albany, Georgia. We moved into the better part of town. It was a simple little Cape Cod house. It was the better part of town. I was approximately in 6th grade. The first week there was an assembly. We had Miss Davis, the principal, and she walked around with this, looked like a college paddle. And when you were bad, her comment was, business is guana pick up, and you wanted to stay away from that cattle. But she came out on the stage, and she said, we're going to sing the national anthem. And then another teacher marched out with the Confederate flag, and they started to sing Dixie.
Wow.
Dumb little Bob sat down. The principal walked over and she says, you are going to join us. Now, I wasn't that liberal and I was a scared little kid, but I didn't get up. My parents were hauled in that day. There was a meeting and they said, we can't protect your child in this school. We moved to the other side of Albany, Georgia, which was a sizable city in a less affluent area, right on the edge of the peanut fields and such, and got along very well in that school. But that was, certainly a major experience. And it was fear. That first day that I was in that school, there were a bunch of boys my age, and they were out to get me after school for not getting into their system.
Well.
Hi there. In 2015 and 2016, we all saw Black Lives Matter. They were in the news every day. They were doing, there were riots. They were shutting down highways. I mean, they were making their voices heard. And then Trump got elected, and I thought, oh boy, here we go, because he does not stand for what Black Lives Matter stands for.
Or anything.
Or anything. But what happened is that Black Lives Matter sort of fell off the map. They disappeared. And I know that police haven't stopped, well, what was that? So I know that the police haven't stopped killing black men and young black men, but we don't see these sort of reactions anymore. And then last week with the indictments that came out of Washington, it's now shown that Russia was co-opting the Black Lives Matter message. And so I'm wondering, I mean, the message was so powerful and it was making such a statement. And then it has the memory of Black Lives Matter been whitened by Russia? Has it been degraded by Russia? Can it be trusted because Russia was involved in it? I don't know.
I'm not even sure how to answer that, what to say to that. I don't know. Like I don't trust anything I see on the internet. I mean, at all. So unless it's come from like specifically somebody that I know, I don't trust anything. I find it all suspect.
Is that true in the regular press?
It's true everywhere. Like, I find it all suspect. I mean, a couple years ago, this little kid named Dexter Youngblood, that was actually his name, sent me a letter. And he said, he goes, Joel Christian Gill, I got a couple of questions for you. I've been looking for these people that you wrote about in your book for the past 6 months, and I can't find any of them. So I want to know two things. One, did you do this just for money? And two, did you make all these people up? So the first thing I was like, well, I mean, it's uncelebrated narratives from Black history, so I draw about obscure Black history, so that makes sense that you couldn't find them, because it took me a long time to find them too. And so I started to think about it and write a letter to this little kid in that respect, and I was like, you know what? No, he shouldn't trust what I just said. This is a good thing. Continue to ask questions, because that's the only way we get to a place where we're actually we don't ask questions. We in America want it spoon-fed to us. We don't want entertainment that is open-ended. We don't want movies that don't make sense. We don't like soccer because sometimes there's not a conclusion. You know what I mean? That is the thing. We need, this is like an American societal thing, and we need to have some ambiguity in our lives. And it's things need to be a little bit more complicated. It can't always be this or that. And I think, Black Lives Matter and the Russia, the infiltration of social media is just indicative of the idea that Russians understand that Americans need one thing or the other. They They know how to manipulate us because we want to be spoon-fed. We don't question things. We want our own truths.
Now, to your question about did the Black Lives Matter go without being noticed? Black Lives Matter went indoors to parent to child. As you noticed how my son speaks, I have taught him, and as each black mother has taught each one of her children that your life matters. Be careful who you talk to. Be careful how you talk to them. And if you're angry, you keep it within yourself and you bring it home. Black lives matter, but Black lives matter because black mothers and fathers have talked to their children. The Black Lives Matter, the explosion has not gone away. What it has gone is indoors and in churches and in places where the black children are. So it's not gone away. Yes.
My name is Fred Ross, and I know a lot of you in here. I spent 35 years altogether in uniform and got out as a major. And some of the fellas in this room probably were drafted at one point or another and been in one branch of the armed forces. When the reality of the Vietnam War hit me, I was guarding an airplane. And I was told by the commander, Sergeant Ross, would you watch the birds while we go in and file a new flight plan? I said, sure. This was at Taki, Thailand, up in northern Thailand. I heard the rotors of helicopters, bloom, 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 bloom. They landed off of the right wingtip. It was very hot. I walked over there. They were full of bodies. Young men, a lot of them clearly Mexican from Mexico, and other minorities. And we have a president who want to build a wall. And the only person who's not really an immigrant of some sort are the indigenous people. And they came over on the land bridge. Is that not correct? Well, again, my family and I, we lived all over, seen a lot of tragedy, a lot of miracles. In Montana, South Dakota, California, South Carolina, Texas, Japan. We've been all over. Decided New Hampshire had a lot to offer. And the only color that I saw that they really appreciate is the color green. We've had several businesses that were relatively successful. But there's some good people here. You can't learn too much about the differences. I'm from Somerville, South Carolina, 17 miles north of Charleston. That's the place these people were murdered in Bible study. I found out recently that the pastor of that church was a distant relative. When they integrated in Somerville, there was very little problems. Why is that? Because they've been diddling each other for 200 years. They're all relatives, the majority of them. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. It's very powerful. I was just thinking of actions that we are already taking and that we can take. I was just thinking of 4 examples. I just watched Hidden Figures. As good as documentary films are, we know it's movies that are seen by far more people. And just using that film alone as a frame of reference in conversations with people to help unlearn our sanitized history. That's one thing. Another one that's quite different is Darrell Davis, the great black jazz pianist, who has gotten Klansmen to quit because he was so humanized in his performance. They're sitting in the audience, and he began talking and listening to them, and he transformed them. It's an extraordinary story, book and film related to that. When you go to all these dozens of plantations, these former plantations that are extolling the virtues of the slave owners and the fine workings of the plantation, ask them, why aren't you extolling the virtues of the enslaved people, as they do at the only museum of slavery in the country, the Whitney Museum in Louisiana? Thank you.
Thank you. Before I have a comment, I wanted to relay that I recall as a kid when my mom got gas at the Esso station, they gave her green stamps for dishes. And I thought that was related to the postal worker and the green book. But anyway, to me, true monuments that would be ageless would not just be physical in nature. It would be in the stories we write, the books we read, the art and dance, the works of man, the culture that we develop. How else would we, from my Jewish race, recall a slavery that happened and was redeemed 3,400 years ago if it wasn't for a Passover Seder that was also the Last Supper of Jesus? So I just want you to comment on what a true monument would be, which maybe is not necessarily physical. Could be the Heritage Trail or whatever New Hampshire establishes. Thank you.
But isn't that what we're fighting over right now? What is the American story and who gets to tell it? I mean, I think you're absolutely right, but we're in a country because of racism that has silenced for hundreds of years. And I think the Civil War story is particularly egregious because that was a war of black liberation. It was not a war between disagreeable white cousins. And that's what's been lost. That's what's been lost. And the black veterans of that war knew it. Frederick Douglass made his almost last public address before he died in New Hampshire at the dedication of the Hale Monument in front of the State House. And the first thing he said was, "I'm surprised you remembered me." So he knew even then, just 30 years after the war had ended, what had happened with that story.
He's doing a great job. I was asked on I did a documentary for Boston Comic-Con, and they asked me what I'd like. We were talking about science fiction, and they asked me what I'd like to see in science fiction. And I think what I said surprised them. I'm like, I'd like to see science fiction where people's race is ambiguous. And they were like, I don't understand. It was like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, when you watch something you watch Star Trek, Discovery, like the newest science fiction on right now, there's still black people and white people, which means we have not evolved in 400 years to actually define that race is still a defined thing. Like the amount of pigment in our skin is still a defined thing. So when you watch that and you see it, you're just like, really? 400 years, we still, like, in space where there's, like, bug people, we still think that there's a difference between a black person and a white person? And so, that's the monument that I'd like to see, is that, once we get past that place where we are now equal, it's like, when will we get to a place where it just doesn't, we have to get to a place, we have to get past the equality part first, right? We're not equal yet. And once we get to equal, then we can get to what doesn't matter. Do you know what I mean? Like, one of the things that I had someone say to me once is like, I don't care it was a colleague at where I teach, and it was like, I don't care if a student is black, white, purple, or other. I just want them to make, great art. And it's just like, no. You have to care. Like, I care what you are, and I'm going to make, my personal responsibility as a human being in this society to make sure that everybody else cares too. And then once we get to that place where we're equal, then we can start saying it doesn't matter what you, then we can start saying I don't see color. Do you know what I mean? Because until we get to that place where we're equal, we're always going to see it. It's like a ridiculous thing anyway. I don't see color. Well, how do you deal with traffic lights? Do you know what I mean? Like, you got to get to a place where we have to have true equality and equity before we can start ignoring everything else. And some people think that we were already there, right? Like, I don't see color anymore. I don't think that. I don't see color. I think, I don't think about people being black, white, or other. And I'm like, well, then you're ignoring a whole lot of stuff, because there's some stuff that's still affecting black people specifically, and you're ignoring those things. So, once we get to that place, then we can get to a place where it's just like it doesn't matter. But until then, Star Trek is just basically, when I hate the diversity thing. Like, let's just get everybody around the table, and you bring your women's intuition, and you bring your black ability to dance, and we're gonna all get around the table, and we're gonna create this this thing. And it's just like, no, it's not about that. It's about understanding that at some point we shouldn't all look like this. We shouldn't all be tribalistic in that sense, because it still matters. And until we get past that, it's still going to matter. So until we get to a place where that no longer matters, we're still going to be in this place.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been very powerful.
You've been waiting a long time, too, for your
Well,
question.
if you knew
Thank
me,
you for being
I could
patient.
wade in on everything that you've said. But one thing is, and I'm a psychotherapist, so that, just know that when I say this, that you're very powerful, and each one of you in your own way, you've made us all think about, and you've been saying in many ways that we need to have the interaction and the conversations. And so I come from the South, and I have lived in many parts of the South as well as up here. So what I'm really asking is, what can we do? I want to be a part of bringing this together. I grew up with all of this. It was just a natural part. And my dad was a minister, so we had a lot of people in our home that I just want to know, how do we get back to that where we're really doing that? And I wondered about, Eric, with you, has what you learned, have you been able to talk about that openly with the people in your community and that sort of thing? So I'm at the stage of life when I want to be part of this, and I need to hear something that teaches us, how do we connect in this way? How do we become open and caring for one another? How do we learn then when to shut up and when to just, maybe say what we really need to say? Is that enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
Personally, I think it takes all kinds of approaches. Some people relate to the story, whether it's history or whether it's current. Some people relate to place, especially to local. Some people want to be brought to a place to explore the story of America and all of its messy past and its messy present. But I guess bringing it local for me, it was learning that people in my little town were still very uncomfortable with talking about a period in their little town that was very unsettling. The narrative in our town, like so many other towns, is, well, we've always been welcoming. We've always been a place where we help each other and we learn from each other and we support folks. And, when you look at just the stories that I was learning about in my town, that just wasn't the case. It wasn't always supportive. It was messy. And people who had just different color skin and stood out were pushed aside. They were on the outside. And sometimes when I would want to discuss the story with some, folks in town, I would get the reaction that, well, it wasn't really racism. It was. How do you know it was racism? Because we support each other in our little town, and they weren't really black because they were mixed race. And I think that's just crazy, because what is there, a box for this is racism and everything outside that box is not racism, and it has to be in that box to be racism. Well, how do you define it? Like I said, things are messy, and this box for people who are black, and there's a box for people who are white. That's nuts too. It's just people, right? And they have a strong legacy of different family people, whether it involved violence or slavery. We don't know. In my story, sometimes we do know, like in Jefferson's case, we do know that story, and it's unsettling. And I think you hit it on the head. It just takes all kinds of ways to connect with different people. And we just can't let some things be completely forgotten.
And, thank you for asking the question. But you're in the front row, but just turn around and look at this room. This didn't just happen. This is Portsmouth as a community decided that this history mattered, and extraordinary people, Jerry Ann, Valerie. We've got Bob Thompson here. Where's Bob? Who's the head of our Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, and I look around and see all these community members who have given so much of their time and their hearts and their souls. And so we don't have to look somewhere else to start and to do something. It's right here.
James Baldwin said that racism didn't stand up to contact. I believe that, what I try to do with the work that I do with my books and when I talk about this is it's all about sharing stories. Because sharing stories humanizes people. My work is about sharing the stories of, obscure Black history stories, but I think it's just about sharing personal stories. It's about, it's about telling somebody that thing that you just said. Here's a personalized story that I know, that changes that. Is that the way you think about it? It's sort of making that connection, and I think that's the important thing. And I also think it's important not to call people racist. And the reason that I say that, and it sounds counterintuitive, but because people have gotten to a place where they think racism is a specific type of thing. Racism is, it's guys in pointy hats burning crosses. But, just as an example, we live in New Boston. When I leave that town, I significantly decrease the Black population, probably by a couple of percentage points. And my mom wants to go to the church all the time, so we go down to the church, and everybody's like, "Oh, we're so happy you're here. We're so glad to see you." And it's just like, "Oh, I know I'm the only Black person in the room, but that's okay." But a lady came up to my mom, and she comes beside her, and she goes, "I wish I could have sat beside you so I could hear you sing." And that's diet racism, right? That's it's a bias that it's like people don't understand, and so it's like and if I told that that's a racist thing, she's like, "I'm not racist, I would have voted for Obama 3 times." You know what I mean? And it's it's a little more subtle than that. It's about understanding where we're coming from, You know what I mean? Understanding. And this really powerful thing happened to me, probably 7 or 8 years ago. I was on the street with this woman who worked at our school, and she's really attractive. We were walking back and forth between two buildings, and she almost stopped traffic. Like, people were like blowing and honking the horns and like yelling stuff. And I'm like, you've got some admirers. And she's just like, yeah, whatever. And like completely blew it off. And so as opposed to just like that being a passing thing that I don't think about, I actually thought about that for a second. And I'm like, what must it be like to not just be able to walk down the street and have that happen to you on a regular basis? What must it be like to not be able to smile at a man who's walking down the street, just to smile to say hello without that being some invitation for harassment? Do you know what I mean? Like, in that moment, I got a little bit of her story and I understood, and I understood that. You know what I mean? And I think that people don't think about it. People don't think that. People don't think what it's like to be somebody else. Like, imagine what it's like when you can't, when you walk into an elevator and you're as big as I am and you're surrounded by white people and you think, I need to make myself look less intimidating. You know what I mean? Like imagine what that's like for anybody. Like, what the differences are, what they bring at, what that means for us, and just like sharing that story. And I think it's important to share stories like that.
I usually come up with this topic each time I come to one of these gatherings. But having visited schools so often throughout New Hampshire, very much so, and other parts of New England, our children are being set up, each young generation, to be racist, because their first introduction in the classroom to the fact that there are even black people in American history comes in February. They start off with Thanksgiving and white people. This is in the very young grades. Yes. And so they're understanding the message really in the classroom. The white child looks at the black child, says, you're not part of our history, till February. And then when it's introduced, it's all South. We're still hanging into that 19th century historian's bias story in our elementary schools. It's all about the South and abolition. Thank God the teachers are enlightened enough. They do get into civil rights and Martin Luther King. But I maintain that at the very beginning for our children, and New Hampshire has a very outstanding teacher's book that should be off the shelves, that teaches the teacher that black people are nothing in the story until much later.
I'll tell a quick story. My son is African American, and in fifth grade class, not far from here, they're going to teach slavery, and so the teacher had them divide up into masters and slaves. And so all my son's little friends want to say, but I want you to know, Harper, I never would have whipped you. So it was okay, it was okay.
I created a hashtag about 3 or 4 years ago when my first book came out, called 28 Days Are Not Enough, about black history. It's that, I keep going, I said this earlier, like it's absurd that I'm not American. Black people are the true e pluribus unum. And I say that because we didn't come from all the same place. We came from different cultures and different tribes, and Jerry Ann grew up eating different things than I did, because of where she's from. And when she gets here, guess what? You're black now. You know what I mean? Like, you're now all part of the same group. And so we really, epitomize e pluribus unum more than anything else. Think about like all of American mythos, every part of American mythos. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Black people did that. You know what I mean? Rags to riches. Black people did that. E pluribus unum. Black people did that. You go to Washington, D.C., any building older than 300 years is black people built. You know what I mean? And like, not to incorporate that history as an integral part of American history is just absurd. It's absolutely absurd. Because if you remove black people from the equation, this is a completely different country. And I'm not saying it's better. Music won't be good. Food probably wouldn't be good. I'm just saying, like, I mean, music and food would not, I mean, when we think about American culture, we typically have a tendency to go to Southern culture. And when we think about Southern culture, who built that? You know, who cooked all that food? Who cooked those apple pies? You know what I mean? That was black people. And I think that people have, like, you know, that idea that, you know, my family's been here since Jamestown and your family came in on Ellis Island and you lost your accent and now you eat hamburgers and you're more American than I am is ridiculous. You know what I mean? It's an absolutely ridiculous thing. And I think it's, you know, education is really important, but I think it's also about sharing the stories and you know, we have this powerful thing in social media now and, like, you know, calling BS when we see it, like looking at the narrative, like when they ask me about the science fiction and I'm like, why can't I see science fiction that doesn't look like that anymore? And people were like, oh, I didn't think about that. I mean, even like Hunger Games, which is science fiction, right? Like when they found that the little girl was black in the Hunger Games, when, you know, that she was supposed to be white in the book. In reality, she wasn't. Everybody was brown in the book. Yeah. And she made a point of saying that. Everybody was brown. But when we got it on the screen, everybody was diverse.
Thank you for saying that. Because I'm not going to be able to say this clearly, turn your cameras off. But obviously this is very complex, and I think we all agree in the room how complex this is, how insidious it is, how subtle the messages are. I love that you just said your last sentence with diverse, and I'd like to rerun what you were saying about you know, the color thing, that we have to factor in color and until we're equal, and then we can forget about color. And then you were talking about Star Trek, and there's bug people, and there's different colored people, and different shapes of people, and I thought I'm trying to train myself to embrace diversity and then move on. You know, there are so many diverse species, not only humans but animals, and don't get me started on that, right? So, I guess my point is, because we do use language when we tell stories, how do we do that? Because we just laughed about the joke about music and food. It would be different in this country without black people, and we all laughed at that, and we all get it, but yet we have to leave this room and deal with other people too. So how do we use, I'll hear people say, oh, I was reading a poster with a person at the library about guitar lessons, and they were black, and we were reading this. You always hear someone interject. I was talking to this black person. I don't hear people interject. I was talking to a white person about a drawing program at the library or something, and we cringe. And my mother-in-law once said that she used the neighbor's pool, Mrs. Love's pool, and she was so kind to let me use her pool. And she's black, but she was so kind. And is it okay to describe people that are diverse with the adjective?
It depends on, in my opinion, it depends on what you're, like, why you're describing them. If you're trying to pick them out in a crowd, you got to say the black person. Do you know what I mean? If it's like, if you're talking about somebody who bought stuff from you the other day, why does that, like, you know what I mean? Like, why do I need to say, well, this white guy came into the store the other day? Like, unless that has some bearing on the conversation, like, I think that's the important thing. But I think it's, you know, this is when I go back to the very first question about the Black Panther and media representation. Like, we need there to be more than a definitive, like, stereotype of what black people are. You know, like, either positive or negative. Like, it needs to be more nuanced than that, because black people are more nuanced than that. Like, we have Trump supporters in our family. You know what I mean? Like, there's like, you know, there's, you know, it's a lot more complicated than just, you know, this thing or that thing. And so, and looking at black people as a monolith of a stereotype is really bad, no matter which way you do it. But it's about representation. It's really about representation. We are fighting a negative, you know, representation. In the media representation, it's kind of like parents teaching children, right? We teach our kids that, you know, this red thing over here, that this is an apple. This is the way an apple is. And so eventually a kid understands this is an apple. And so for the last, 200 years or so, media representation has been, this is a black person. This is what they mean. You know what I mean? And it's going to take a lot of positive reinforcement to actually change that understanding. And this is true of everybody. There are studies that have been shown that, everybody in America, you live in American society, you have a negative opinion of black people, like you do. Like, no matter what, black people have a negative opinion of black people. Black people have taken these unconscious bias tests and failed them as well. When we don't fail them? When we watch previously some uplifting thing about black people. So when we get information about black people that says that we're not like the others, or we're not the norm, or not the stereotype, it changes our perception. And I think that we need to do more of that, right? More positive reinforcement of black people. We need more movies with Will Smith in them as the lead. Do you know what I mean? Like, we need that. And movies with Will Smith in the lead, where it's not about whether Will Smith is a black man or not, he's just a lead. Like The Equalizer with Denzel Washington. It doesn't really matter that he's black. He's
Joel?
just, you know what I mean? So, I'm sorry.
Sorry. We're almost out of time, so this is the last question for the day.
So it's more of a comment than a question, just to thank the Black History Trail for putting together all of these events. And I personally always feel inspired when I'm at events like this as a New Englander, a black New Englander, that can trace my family back to the Revolutionary War as free black people. I feel like it's really, really important that we uncover those stories in New England. And the more we tell them, the more, this is not the right word, but sort of normalized we are in the conversation, so that it's not strange, it's not weird. I'm not weird, my family is not unusual. And we're not the only family like this. And Joel, when I get the "where are you from," I'm really from here. And I think the more manifestations of that history in the physical being, like me being here today, are really, really important. Thank you. And thank you for emphasizing the need to tell stories. I want to come see the cellar holes. And there's a place in Walpole I want to tell you about as well. So I think as the history trail comes along, more and more we'll get to a place where it's not just this anomaly, it's not sort of a special thing, and the whitewashing of the past will start to go away. And I do think it's drip drops of water over time. So thank you so much.
Good afternoon. So I'm Bob Thompson. I'm the honored to be the president of the board of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. Thanks to our panelists, including 2 board members. And thanks for all the shout outs about the trail. I appreciate that. Thanks to all of you for coming. These trails, these tea talks are organized by Jerry Ann Burgess, and along with her great group of volunteers that do so much to support the trail and the efforts. So I think we And the comment about what's taught in schools, in Portsmouth, you have a trail. And so it doesn't have to begin in February. The trail is very nicely walked in the fall and spring, any time of the year. And so there's an opportunity to really do history different in this community because of the citizens of Portsmouth. It really is pretty amazing if you think about what is in this town, given the demographics. That there would be a burying ground honoring slave ancestors who were discovered, that there would be a trail, and now a national trail in this second or third whitest state in the nation. A reality born by some of us more dearly than others. And I speak to you as a black man who sings and dances and tells jokes. But I want to thank you, and next week, come back the same time, same place. Another great tea talk. You want to tell us what the title is next week? You want to remind me? Anyone got the? Ain't I a woman? Ain't I not? Well, ain't I a woman? So please come and continue to build authentic connections. And I want to send you off with a song. Oh, freedom! Oh, freedom! Oh, freedom over me! And before my grave and go home to my Lord and be free, and go home to my Lord and be free. Thanks for coming.
Samuel Delaney?